You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD candidate at Northwestern University studying Russian literature and film.
And I'm Cameron Lalana, literature enthusiast and a guy working in media.
This is the podcast for people who want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture. Every episode, we're going to be bringing you the background and analysis you'll need to know and understand these works.
If you're interested in supporting us, you can head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. All right, Matt, what are we getting into this week? And I'm so excited for this.
This week, we got a double doctor episode. We're joined by doctors José Vergara and Sara Karpukhin. We are going to be covering Vladimir Nabokov's Signs and Symbols. It is a story that will involve mention of suicide, so if you'd prefer not to hear that discussion, proceed with caution, and I will just make Cameron have to mark that down in the show notes. José Vergara is an assistant professor of Russian on the Myra T. Cooley Lectureship at Bryn Mawr College. He is the author of All Futures Plunge to the Past, James Joyce in Russian Literature, published in 2021, which we've talked about once on the podcast before. You should, also check the show notes for that episode. He is also the co-editor of a book that we're going to be talking a little bit about today, Reimagining Nabokov Pedagogies for the 21st Century, published just last year, 2022, and it's an open access if anybody wants to read, which is wonderful. His current research projects include a bilingual annotated digital edition of Sasha Sokolov's Between Dog and Wolf and the study of contemporary Russian prison writing. Sara Karpukhin is a lecturer in Russian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her interests include queer and feminist thought and art, anthropology, philosophy of different sameness, diasporic identity-making, uses of the classical tradition, and Vladimir Nabokov. She is also one of the co-editors of the volume Reimagining Nabokov Pedagogies for the 21st Century, published last year. Again, open access, you should read it, or else. Jose, Sara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Signs and Symbols. Do you mind, before we get into anything else, and we have a lot to cover here today, so you chose Signs and Symbols, and do you mind kind of talking through why you suggested that we reread Signs and Symbols to talk about Nabokov today?
To me, Signs and Symbols is nice and short, first of all, and second of all, it's a nice introduction to Nabokov's prose works and his art in general. It is kind of an elevator pitch for his art that I use in my Nabokov course that I teach every fall, and it includes two impulses, I would say. One that invites the specifically Nabokovian reading, which is controlled and predetermined in its outcome, and the other one, which disrupts and resists it, leaves all interpretive conclusions inconclusive. And it differs in terms of reception by a specialist reader and a student, and the specialist reader tends to kind of look for that predeterminate reading, that kind of answer to what the story is about, and the non-specialist reader, like a student, would encounter the indeterminacy of the outcome and kind of enjoy it, sit with it a little bit. And I appreciate, I think, both aspects of the story. And it's interesting to have a story that includes both somehow, magically.
I would agree with that. Also, it's just a very readable story. It's 6 pages in length. And in those 6 pages, in relatively few words, Nabokov manages to convey so much tragedy. You can kind of dig around and we can talk about this tragedy in terms of history and what maybe has happened to the family at the core of the story in the past. Kind of allusions and subtext there. Tragedy in terms of this boy's mental state and the sadness that his parents feel for him. Just a very moving story, and I think how compact it is speaks to Nabokov's skill in conveying all of this in so few words.
So speaking of the compactness of the plot, since that's a very good segue for Cameron to just give us 1 minute rundown on the plot.
Absolutely.
What happens in these 6 pages?
In this very brief,
I gotta know.
I know you're going to find out as we go. So in these very brief 6 pages, we have, in essence, the story of these two older people, these two immigrants to the U.S., who are going to visit their son, wwho is in a sanitarium or a mental hospital of some sort. and they're having a rough go of it. They're having a bad day. Everything is not going their way, and it gets worse when they get there. And the staff who they have interacted with before and do not react well to them come out and say, "Hey, he attempted suicide last night, and we're worried that you and your presence will upset that, and upset what we've managed to do since then." So they get sent home. Worse for the wear. Now it's raining. Things just bad day, already getting worse. I believe if I recall correctly, it's the son's birthday too, or it's nearby the son's birthday. So now their attempt to even just give him a gift is also swept away. As we kind of move on from there, we also are learning more about the son's past, how he started off as kind of like their dear child, but as he got older, his unique features, I guess we can call them, his sort of idiosyncrasies, went from being kind of their sign that this is a bright young man who's got a lot ahead of him, who's got a great world ahead of him, and is in fact not doing so well, and eventually leads him to be institutionalized as it happens. And from there, we follow back into talking more about kind of how his mental state was, what led him to be institutionalized, before we kind of jump back into the current timeline where we have they are on the same day, they've come home. It's now late at night. After trying to go to bed, the husband kind of gets back up and comes back out to the living room where the wife is still in the living room, and he tells her he can't sleep, and he starts to come up with this plan to get their son and bring him home, and starts kind of, as he's walking around, he's saying, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to take care of him. This is how we're going to make sure that he doesn't hurt himself. And then as they're doing that, the phone rings, and the wife, who speaks English better than the husband, she picks it up, and a dull voice, a young girl's voice on the other end, asks if she can speak to Charlie. And the wife says, no, you got the wrong number. She hangs up, and then the two go back to their conversation. The phone rings again and again. The same voice asks for Charlie, and the wife again says, you have the wrong number. I'll tell you what you're doing. You're turning zero rather than zero rather. And she puts it down again as they sit down to their tea. Now kind of you come into a very present moment with them as the passage extends. And then as you kind of think upon the gift which they got in their son, the jars of little jellies, the phone rings one last time, and that's where we leave the story. So speaking of readings, non-specialist and specialist readings kind of leaves you in an interesting place, and that interesting place is a point that we'll touch on a lot later. Before we start jumping into the analysis, should we talk a little bit more about Nabokov, talk a little bit about his background?
I want to talk about his background. I want to talk about the editorial strife when it came to publishing Signs and Symbols, or Symbols and Signs, depending on whichever version you're looking at, depending on how hard the New Yorker has edited the version you're reading.
That's right. We'll have a link to an edition of it in the show notes. You should be aware. It was printed originally. I think it was printed originally in the New Yorker. They did make some changes to it, such as reversing the story as we know it now, Signs and Symbols, to Symbols and Signs, as well as a few other changes. So
the title doesn't sound as good to me. Signs and Symbols sounds more natural. I don't know.
It does.
It's because they're specialists. They wanted you to know that it's a symbol. Maybe. I don't know.
I would love to have known what was going through that editor's mind as they decided this is where we have to take a stand. This is something we need to change.
I would like to know what was going on in Catherine White's head as she decided to change the title. I always assumed that Signs and Symbols is what it says on maps, usually. When there's a legend at the bottom, like, oh, these are the symbols we're using on the map. And it's like a fixed expression. I always thought that Nabokov needed it to be in that order, in that particular phrase, not just because it's, I don't know, semantic or whatever, but because, it's a recognizable reference to most American readers. I have no idea what was going on at the New Yorker and why they decided to change it. But yes, they did. They changed the way the paragraphs are broken in the story, and I honestly am almost reluctant to go into the strife or the, I don't know, the controversy that or the riddle or whatever that may be surrounding the editorial changes, I usually tell my students, and I usually rest with the idea that what Nabokov was doing when changing the New Yorker version to the second published version was simply just, tidying things up. It just looks better. It reads better. He expanded some paragraphs, like the famous sentence about the mother's impression of their life, and the amount of tenderness that is crushed or wasted or turned into madness. All of that, the sentence that this phrase contains was expanded in the, as far as I remember, was expanded in the second published version. And it sounds better, and it sounds more poignant, and it sounds like more evocative of the sense of tragedy that they're all going through. So that being said, I feel as a scholar, I should be honest about the controversy and the puzzle that people identified and decided to solve once they've identified the puzzle. The paragraphs, the way they're numbered, and change of a letter from beach spelled B-E-E-C-H to B-E-A-C-H. It's a name of a jam. So beach plum spelled differently. And the correct version is B-E-A-C-H, as far as I remember. And it was something else in the beginning. And one of the readers of Nabokov, trained to look for puzzles and decipher them, decided that the original spelling, the incorrect one, was a reference to Buchenwald, because Buchenwald is beach, wood, B-E-E-C-H. So another Holocaust reference to somehow, by this hidden message, amplify the general anti-Nazi sentiment, I guess, of the story. The reason I'm mentioning this is because people have tried to find it. People do pursue this as a kind of like a kind of referential mania that the boy is suffering from in the story. But at the same time, I do not feel like it's changing the main thrust of the story.
So I feel like before we go into more of the analysis on signs and symbols, I kind of wanted to give our audience a little bit more of an overview of, because this is the first time that we've talked about Nabokov on the podcast, so this is wonderful, first of all. But I also kind of wanted to give a little bit more of a general kind of overview of how the scholarship has proceeded on him. And I know in your book, in your introduction, Sarah, you gave kind of a wonderful overview of this. And I was wondering if you might be able to just elaborate a little bit on, it's really good. It's really easy, I know, to condense just, tens and tens of years, decades of scholarship into like a minute. Super easy thing to do. So I was wondering if you might be able to just kind of briefly talk about some of the major trends, some of how Nabokov is brought now into the classroom, some of these challenges that we're facing with him, with students, for instance. There's kind of a lot going on. It's a really interesting kind of subject that is both aside from signs and symbols, but also kind of inherently related to it. And how we approach it as well.
Yeah, in a nutshell, a couple of generations, or maybe 3 generations at this point, of Nabokov scholars trying to decipher all those riddles and puzzles and messages, hidden messages. Nabokov himself, in his later years, in his 40s and 50s, when he was teaching at a college, at colleges, various universities in America, became interested in producing some kind of roadmap or set of instructions on how to read fiction, prose, specifically, his particular realm. In those instructions, for his students primarily, mind you, not for his own readers, not for critics, not for academics, for his students. He emphasized the importance of imagination, artistry, artifice, in fact, and some X factor, some unknown element that cannot be predicted, cannot be quantified, but that animates and illuminates a work of art when it becomes a work of art at the hands of a writer of genius, obviously. The first generation of Nabokov scholars who had the advantage of, first of all, being students in some cases of Nabokov when he was teaching. And second of all, those of scholars who saw what Nabokov wanted to see in other people's prose works when he was a teacher, took those sets of instructions as kind of like, again, a set of instructions on how to read Nabokov himself. So they extrapolated those onto him. And at the same time, there were various academic trends of literary scholarship that go about the work of interpreting a work of art in different ways. And predominantly in the Russian tradition, this is Russian formalism, and then new criticism in the Anglo-American tradition. All of those together. So Nabokov's own set of instructions, and then academic traditions within various cultural traditions kind of adjacent to Nabokov's work, created that first wave of Nabokov scholarship, which was about close reading, about artifice and artistry. And very often, because Nabokov tried to send this message in his interviews and in his paratextual statements, he would often say that, oh, I have a message in all of my books. It's just a matter of finding it and then deciphering it. Something very Joycean, by the way. I think José can probably say more about this. So how to ensure immortality in posterity, right? You create a bunch of riddles, or you pretend to create a bunch of riddles, and then you convince your readers and critics and academics that, oh, you guys will be busy for the next 100 of years, deciphering those. That was the first wave. The second wave, third wave, kind of amplified and built on that. And the most important development in the second generation of Nabokov scholars, probably, or maybe one and a half, would be the addition of the metaphysical dimension. So the tradition of interpreting Nabokov's work as if hinting at some kind of ineffable metaphysical knowledge, something about the life in the beyond, the other world, to quote the title of the seminal work in that vein of Nabokov scholarship. And that was 1990s. And then a combination of all those, so intertextual, close reading, and then metaphysical, various kinds. Signs and Symbols kind of gives material to all of them. You can read it as a hidden, ineffable, inarticulate, indeterminate message about the afterlife, or you can read it as a clever puzzle. It's a cleverly constructed story. It's a tantalizingly constructed story. And you can guess or try to guess what the author intended or what the author knew about what he was trying to do. The final thought that I had about this was about the current state of Nabokov scholarship, which is in a state of productive disarray, I would say. But that's my impression, and I feel like my impression is very limited. And I'm kind of focused on the project that José and I did last, which was so exciting for that very reason. Like, it tried to be revolutionary. I don't know, radical, but I'm not sure if that's José's impression. I think we talked about this, about how radical we wanted this project to be, or how radical it ended up being. But in one way, at least as far as I'm concerned, I do believe that there's a demand, at least on the part of students, to question some of the answers that previous traditions of Nabokov scholarship gave to some of the questions that his art poses. And maybe identify other questions that previous traditions never asked. And I really hope this is the way it goes. It remains to be seen, but that was the feeling that I had, that I wanted to kind of put into the book, I thought wanted to put into the book, and José may add maybe more to that.
Yeah, what is the book? What is the project? I want to hear more from the editors.
Sure. So the book is called Reimagining Nabokov: Pedagogies for the 21st Century. I can mention our original title was going to be Teaching Nabokov, something along the lines of Teaching Nabokov to Generation Z, which turned out not to be a good title for various reasons. We didn't want to limit it to a particular generation, to a particular moment. 21st century at least gives us more time or more life to this book, hopefully. Again, is available open access. And also with the war in Ukraine and this Z movement in Russia, adopting this Z as a symbol for support for the war, it was not ultimately the direction we wanted to go with. But the title we settled on, Reimagining Nabokov: Pedagogies for the 21st Century, I think speaks to the mission, at least that we set out with, to rethink how we're teaching Nabokov, what context we want to incorporate in the classroom and in the scholarship. I think a lot of the essays in this volume speak both to recent Nabokov scholarship and new paths, et cetera, new directions that people are pursuing in studying Nabokov, and then how that's applied to the classroom. So there's a range of essays or topics within these essays. The first section deals with essentially digital projects, digital humanities projects related to Nabokov that have been used in the classroom. I contributed an essay in this section. And then other sections have to do, again, with alternative readings to Nabokov, or of Nabokov. Like Sara was saying, trying to read him from new angles, to historicize him in different ways, to reimagine him as much as we could. We wanted to incorporate essays that deal with texts that are maybe less commonly taught or read in the classroom. And I can mention that was a little tougher than we hoped, but may be obvious in hindsight that the things that are usually taught are the things that are usually taught. So getting around that is not impossible, but more difficult if it simply doesn't exist or doesn't happen. But I think we got some of that. And our hope is to motivate, inspire other instructors and readers of Nabokov to consider him in new ways.
I liked it a lot. Sorry, if I may just say, I thought it was very interesting, because I feel like a lot of times you'll get kind of the either or. You'll get, here's a new pedagogical approach that's interesting, or you'll get, here's a new reading that's interesting. But what I got from the book, at least, was the way that this sort of new approach to Nabokov can be intertwined with a new pedagogical approach overall. And so to me, that was very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
And I just want to say again that I love that it's open access, because we have a lot of people that are interested in this stuff, and it is so incredibly prohibitive if you do not have an institutional affiliation, which a lot of our listeners do not, because it costs big money. So it's really wonderful that this can be available to people that are just interested, but are not professors, or who are not fools who went into graduate school, such as I.
I should mention too, it's published by Amherst College Press, and I want to, thank them and make a plug to our editor Hannah and the press as a whole. I think this model of publishing open access, so anyone anywhere in the world can access the book. It's born digital, is incredible, and I think radical in its own right. Like you're hinting at here, academic books or books published by academic publishers tend to be expensive, prohibitively expensive. And this is free if you want the digital version. If you want a print copy, it's print on demand for just $20, which is pretty great. And I think this speaks to the kind of radical impulses of the project as well, that we want these ideas to be available to anyone who's interested.
Yeah, it's not always bad, right? When you get an academic publisher, it's publishing a book for other academics. It's not really meant for everyone. I mean, we could say it is all we want, but a lot of times some of these books, they're really just for like 25 people,
right?
Max. But it's not a book that's written for just scholars of Nabokov, right? It is, at least to me, I thought it was an accessible read that's still not like it's talking down to your audience, though. It's still very challenging at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't mind, I'm going to I still want to talk about the book very briefly, but also kind of transition us into talking about signs and symbols, or symbols and signs, as the New Yorker would have you believe. And I do want to say one thing that, at least talking about non-specialist readers, going into it as someone who's not, is not a teacher of literature. First of all, I got to say it's very readable, even from a relative newcomer. But also, when I read your contributions to this book, I get the kind of two takeaways I got were, first of all, the importance of communal reading, of reading not as, always a solo activity, but as one where getting at knowledge can be enhanced by other people through, like the project that you did, Jose, of having your students work online and have those, communal annotations. And so that's good that we're in this podcast. Now we can all kind of talk to each other and build on these ideas. So in addition to that, I kind of wanted to talk briefly about, as I was reading your piece, Sara, you talk about this idea of reparative epistemology. And I know we've been kind of talking about a lot of larger concepts, but at least when I was reading that, I was kind of, some things were clicking in terms of, after I'd read Signs and Symbols, and I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. This I feel like I understand this piece better in light of how you're talking about of this notion. Which do you mind just elaborating a little bit on that idea and evolving in net reading, because at least for me it helped makes sign symbols make more sense.
Thank you so much for that comment and the invitation to maybe elaborate about this, because yes, oh my God, it definitely. What's the word? There's almost like a natural marriage between reparative reading and signs and symbols. It's something that can and almost should happen in the story, or in the mind of the reader reading the story. Very briefly, reparative epistemology, the term itself, comes from Elizabeth Kosofsky-Sedgwick's famous classical canonical essay written in the 1990s on the difference between reparative reading and paranoid reading. In her argument, a paranoid position, it's a position. It's not necessarily a kind of knowledge. It's a way to acquire or harvest knowledge, or maybe glean knowledge from a text, a symbol, or something else. And in her reading, paranoid position is everywhere. She argues that this is how we generally approach uncertainty. Whenever there is something to be known, we usually know or learn or find out or discover or read from a position of a paranoid, in her terminology. Again, it's not psychologically diagnostic necessarily, but it's a position where we are afraid. We are driven by fear. We are driven by fear of humiliation, of missing something, of not knowing, essentially. It is about enmity. It's about trying to find proof that the author is hiding something from us, and we are out to outmaneuver or outsmart that sinister figure, the author. It is based, according to Sedgwick, in the hermeneutics of suspicion, but described, theorized by Paul Ricoeur in the 20th century. And again, she says the paranoid position is everywhere. This is how we know, learn, find out, and read. She suggests that fear doesn't have to be the only position or the only drive or the only effect that drives your reading. We don't have to be afraid when we read something. We don't have to hurry to know to prevent being afraid when we read something. She suggests that instead of being afraid, we can actually be driven by joy. We can choose positive effect as our goal. We don't have to be always on the lookout, always embedded within that hermeneutics of suspicion or epistemology of enmity, as she calls it. Instead, we can actually be motivated by a wish to find or to give or to show care or to experience joy or pleasure or become overinvested in style and play. So something else that it's kind of like a psychological concept or complex behind our motivation for reading may be different. I wanted it to be brief, but I feel like it's not brief at all. But the most important part is that the reparative position is about acknowledging they're both pessimistic, both paranoid and reparative. They both acknowledge that the conditions for reading, the conditions where knowledge is produced, are bad. We are tragically isolated, misunderstood, or deceived, or we're facing systemic oppression or something else, whatever that may be. Both of those positions acknowledge it. It's just that what we seek in reading and knowing and forming or producing knowledge may be different. It's not to confirm our fear that pushed us towards a text. It is to repair the world by the imperfect means we find. So this idea was proposed in the 90s. It became popular in queer theory. In particular, there is a reparative turn that many scholars kind of adopted since then. It's a form of queer optimism. We acknowledge the repression, we acknowledge the deficiency or the isolation or the repression and persecution and trauma, but we choose to respond to all that with not with the confirmation of that fear, but something else, right? A different effect. We're looking for something else while we still can, as long as we breathe.
Maybe we can link it to Signs and Symbols a little bit. And I don't know if we've explicitly said kind of why we're talking about this. I think we've sort of hinted at it that, the common, I don't know about the common, but a frequent reading of the story, as we've kind of said, is that all of these apparent signs and symbols throughout the text, and I can quote some of them. It's one of the first paragraphs. That Friday, everything went wrong. The underground train lost its life current between two stations, and for a quarter of an hour, one could hear nothing but the dutiful beating of one's heart and the rustling of newspapers. The bus they had to take next kept them waiting for ages. And when it did come, it was crammed with garrulous high school children. It was raining hard as they walked up the brown path leading to the sanatorium. And I'm going to skip ahead, but kind of the most graphic one, I think, for me is a few feet away under a swaying and dripping tree. A tiny, half-dead, unfledged bird was helplessly twitching in a puddle. So the kind of traditional reading of the text, I think, is that the narrator, Nabokov, is inserting all these images, all these details to kind of push us toward reading pessimistically, and maybe like a paranoid person might. And by the end of the story, we're expecting bad thing after bad thing after bad thing to happen. And all of these things, these images, these moments in the story are imbued with this pessimism and this suggestion that things are just going to keep going wrong. And thus that final third phone call by that little girl, or the girl, is actually not the girl, but the sanatorium calling to say that the young man had in fact committed suicide. He had a history of attempted suicide, and the story just kind of dropping off at the end there might be this gloomy ending. So I think, yeah, along the lines of what Sarah was saying, there's that tendency, or the story kind of pushes us to read in this direction, and to read and kind of see, read meaning into these images that, don't have any meaning on their own. The little birds die all the time. That sounds like a crazy thing to do. We have this bird apartment in our backyard, meaning a big birdhouse with multiple entrances and stuff. So we find some dead birds occasionally.
Right. They're fragile creatures.
They are. Yeah.
I'm immediately more suspicious of Jose now.
Yeah, I realize that's how it's sounding. But that doesn't mean that what that phone call is actually signifying is the boy's death. But that's one way, it has been read. And alternatively, I don't know if it's necessarily reparative, Sarah, you can confirm or not, but my preferred take, or the way that I prefer to read the story, is that this isn't a puzzle to solve. That these things don't mean anything on their own, but we can appreciate this instability, this uncertainty, this in-betweenness of everything. The boy is not dead by the end of the story, for sure. You can read it one way or read it the other. It's this both and at the same time. It's the cat in the box, right? Schrodinger's cat. It's there's no unveiling of the cat boy bird hybrid, and that's the point, to my mind, that we can appreciate the text, appreciate the style, appreciate the imagery, and kind of take pleasure in this kind of experience of wrestling with these images, whether or not they ultimately mean anything.
Right. And that's why I gotta say, I really appreciated reading your, even though obviously the book you've edited in talking about pedagogies doesn't directly touch on signs and symbols. Like when I said, it helped me like really pull it all together, because after I initially read it, I started doing some background reading, and I won't specifically name these articles I was reading, but they were really getting into, like you talked about, the nitty gritty of like you said, Sarah, of a suggestion of these characters are suggested to be Jewish, and they've had people who in their family who were killed in the Holocaust, and therefore, that beach is a reference to Buchenwald, and therefore, talking about death, or talking about how all these other named characters start with, soul, and all these these particulars, or even one was like talking about how, I forget, like the number of lines in the paragraph spelled out in 1948, 1947, the year of publication. And I was kind of like, I don't get this. I feel like I'm being led to suggest, so much is being led to suggest so much, but I don't follow where it's going.
Once you've reached like Pierre and War and Peace,
right, right.
Spelling, and but it's like numerology, side plot, I think you've gone just like a touch over.
Yeah. So we're going to that, and I was reading, your piece, you started talking about reparative epistemology, and I was like, oh, I think I get this. I go back and I read it again, and there's this passage which now stands out to me, which makes me, and I don't know if you would agree with this characterization or not, leads me towards kind of what you're talking about, Jose, of, oh, this feels like a joke. A joke's being played on us as a reader, especially for a suspicious reader, when Nabokov talks about what the psychologist term say that this, the son has, which leads to him being institutionalized, which they call referential mania in these, from the text here. In these very rare cases, the patient imagines that everything happening around him is a veiled reference to his personality in existence. He excludes real people from the conspiracy because he considers himself to be so much more intelligent than other men. Phenomenal nature shadows him wherever he goes. Clouds in the staring sky transmit to each other by means of slow signs, incredibly detailed information regarding him, and so on and such forth. And I went back and I was on the second read, I was reading that, and I was like, oh, so this is kind of, in this reading, at least to my understanding, makes this just joke. Like, it's putting all these things out here for you to lead you in a circle going nowhere. I don't know if you'd agree with that characterization. I guess there's certainly reasons to say other readings could still be legitimate, but it did, for me at least, tie it together.
Definitely, the reader is kind of pushed to at least entertain the possibility of engaging in a little bit of referential mania that the boy is suffering from, clearly suffering from. I think suffering is the operative word. And the author is saying almost saying, we can imagine him saying that a paranoid state of mind where so many bad things happened in a row and you can only expect bad things to happen next, is going to deprive you of joy, basically, if you persist in this. And most importantly, it's not just about an emotional payout of paranoid versus reparative. It's about cognitive honesty almost, because what paranoid kind of attention is doing is it eliminates surprise. It basically describes the world before we see the world. Your brain kind of preempts whatever's going to happen. And Nabokov is saying, not only will you miss joy if you do that, if you persist in this referential mania, if you know what's going to happen next, you will actually miss what the world is really about. It's way more surprising and varied and different and unexpected and unpredictable than we may assume. It's almost like a cognitive exercise as much as an emotional exercise. At least that's what I would probably say to my students in order to advertise the story.
Yeah. Well, speaking of it, as we know, we've been kind of talking in sort of this direction of understanding, but I also want to ask and kind of open up a space to say, are there other, features or elements or other readings you think might be important for people to understand in going into the story to understand it? Or do you feel like this reading captures what you would consider to be the most important parts?
I personally like what José just said, and I want to amplify that. That place of indeterminacy at the end of the story. We actually don't know what happens. Our brain wants to jump to conclusions, for sure, but it doesn't mean that it's not what the story is doing. It's not what the story is telling us. It leaves us there in that space. And maybe it's worthwhile to sit in that space of indeterminacy, of not knowing, of being open to either possibility, of maybe examining what it is that we feel. I really like that. And it's academically, it's untenable. That's the horrible thing. Like intellectually, it leaves you itchy. It's almost like something's like, I need an answer. It's just, if it's just a question mark, it's not enough, it seems. And in that sense, this is why I think it was so liberating to work on the project that José and I were working on, because it was focused on pedagogy, and pedagogy allows for that sense of open-endedness. I think way more than academic scholarship, more than criticism, let's put it this way. Criticism wants to give answers. If it's all just about, we don't know, then it's difficult to justify our existence to our fiscally minded superiors in the academic hierarchy. Students love that, though. That's the beauty of it. It's liberating in that sense.
I think sometimes they don't, though, right? Some students expect and demand answers or want that.
For sure. They tolerate it. They tolerate it more, I think, than our colleagues.
I think, though, it's different. It's answering a different question in your book than what criticism is always trying to answer. And in a lot of ways, it's a more important question now, which is, how do you get people to like reading? And how do you get them interested in reading things that are very challenging? And so that, I think, is sort of democratic in some ways, in the sense that it's not me telling you what the interpretation is, because everybody realizes, right, this is your own interpretation, right? Nobody really ultimately holds that key to understanding. And so I think acknowledging that in the classroom is a first step in sort of bringing back that joy that we have into reading. And right, acknowledging that college is not supposed to just be, I tell you something and then you remember it the rest of your life. It's sort of it is right, a new way to conceptualize, really everything, but even the process of learning itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really important thing for an instructor to like have an awareness of or have some sort of working knowledge of. So that's what I thought was interesting reading through and trying to link it back to signs and symbols because I don't know. I thought like if I had to lecture on this, I thought about it and I was like, this would be like, I don't know. I wouldn't like lecturing on this. I would want to discuss it, right? It's like a different mindset.
Yeah, well, that's what made what I was really thinking of as I was going into or coming out of, I guess, reading your piece, Jose, which is that talking about this hermeneutics of suspicion, it almost feels like to me, and I'm going to come out of here with left field of talking about something that very not literary, which is that a dominant way of understanding media. Maybe you could blame this on Marvel. I don't necessarily know if you should, but when you go and talk to non-specialists about media, you predominantly have this idea of like, people talk about theories of media. Like, what does this really mean? What is the secret behind here? What is actually going on here? This similar idea, I think, of like, there is a secret world here, which we have to come in as an audience and decode these symbols to figure out what it is. And it feels like even people who are not in this discipline, who might only engage with mass media, are kind of trained to be similarly suspicious of everything they're doing. What does this really mean? What's really going on here? Who's really a Skrull? And I don't know if that lands with anyone, but
I got it. Don't worry.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. But like when your piece, and maybe maybe let me know if this is not your experience. These are your students, but you do a lot of projects with your students. I haven't been on Twitter recently, but in the past I've been on there. You're always posting like creations, memes, drawings your students create, which I always think is great. But in this sort of communal reading, by doing those communal notes, it felt like the direction or how they talked about it. I can't say it shifted, but the way they primarily engaged with it was in this, like, I don't know, at least some of the quotes you chose, like this not suspicious way, in this way that some of them approached it with humor, some of them approached it with sincerity, but they approached it with, like, as kind of Sarah you've talked about, not without fear, but with at least despite fear, maybe I should say. It seems like it kind of just inherently, this communal reading almost seems to push away that suspicion by necessity of engaging with someone else. I don't know if you agree with that characterization.
I think that's fair. So really quickly, what I did in that class was create a website. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can provide the link if anyone's curious. And students wrote some essays, but part of the project was that they would annotate the series of novels that we read throughout the semester. We read Invitation to Beheading, one of Nabokov's Russian novels. We were reading it in translation. And what I took away from that experience of designing this assignment for the students was that it was really freeing and liberating. I think, traditionally, it's a lot of top-down instruction and in classes. Obviously, I'm there as the quote-unquote expert. I shouldn't say quote-unquote. I'm being humble. There's information, context, interpretations that I do share with them, but I want my classroom space to be a space of experimentation and exploration of these texts. Like Sara was suggesting, this is a space where we can get away with that, and where I think we should encourage it, and having students experiment and try different kinds of readings and be open to taking risks. And I think Nabokov is great for this. There's a long history of various kinds of readings and approaches to Nabokov, but we're not limited to those readings. Some of these students were taking a Russian literature class for the first time and were kind of nervous about doing that. But, I tasked them with looking up references to things or places or people in the novel. Some of them are real, some of them are not. And that, I think, gave them a lot of agency in being responsible, essentially, for a particular chunk of the text that they could then bring into the discussions and feel comfortable or more familiar, and kind of wield interpretive power that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise. And being able to share that with others, I think, is really powerful and productive for podcast reading groups or classrooms, all these sorts of things where you have these different perspectives and different backgrounds and experiences kind of merging or exchanging. And I think, again, that's at the heart of our project and at the heart of kind of the Nabokov studies that I want to see, where we can try new things, and we can encourage our students and others, colleagues, people not in academia to approach Nabokov openly, both in terms of the approaches you take and kind of taking on the challenge. He's not always an easy read, but it's worth it, I think, and it's pleasurable to read him as well. I'd be curious to hear what Sara has to say about this, and you, Matt, and Cameron as well. As far as I understand, you hadn't read this before, but one thing that I think is important, or maybe useful to think about as you read the story, is the shifts in narration, which are still kind of a puzzle to me, because we begin. I mean, the whole thing is beautifully written. I think that's undeniable, but it's relatively, I don't know, more or less straightforward documentation of what's happening to this family. But then there are these passages that kind of appear maybe out of nowhere. Maybe it's emanating out of the characters' minds. But they're much more poetic. And Sara alluded to one of these earlier. This and much more she accepted, for after all, living did mean accepting the loss of one joy after another. Not even joys in her case, mere possibilities of improvement. She thought of the endless waves of pain that for some reason or other she and her husband had to endure. Of the invisible giants hurting her boy in some unimaginable fashion, of the incalculable amount of tenderness contained in the world, of the fate of this tenderness, which is either crushed or wasted or transformed into madness, of neglected children humming to themselves in unswept corners, of beautiful weeds that cannot hide from the farmer, and helplessly have to watch the shadow of his simian stoop leave mangled flowers in its wake as the monstrous darkness approaches. And I realized after talking about dead baby birds, this passage is going to be a very odd impression of me. Nonetheless, these moments that the narration shifts the way things are described, and I think it's still a bit of a puzzle, maybe not one with a solution, as we've discussed, but something I think worth paying attention to as you read. Sara, did you?
Yeah, thank you so much for reading the entire sentence. It's my favorite sentence. It's dead center in the story. I think, as far as I remember, I don't have the book handy, but it is so evocative and so poetic, as you said, José. It's kind of draws all the attention to itself. When I first started reading, when I first started teaching the story, I reread it. And I noticed, I'm not sure if it's the same thing that we're talking about, that you, José, was talking about specifically, but I noticed that the narration varies or alternates between matter-of-fact statement of some kind of deprivation, some kind of tragedy, some kind of pain, source of pain, loss, hurt, with that kind of evocative language. In the very first part of the story, when referential meaning is described, that paragraph ends with a similarly poetic. Poetic doesn't do justice to it. It's like mesmerizing. This kind of language about granite, about groans of firs. I really wish I had the book at hand, but I noticed it when I first started teaching, and then I tried to explain it when I pointed it out to my students by saying that Nabokov does or engages with a little bit of cognitive disinhibition every time he mentions pain. I think pain was one of his creative preoccupations, suffering in its most irredeemable form, something that does exist in the world and screams for some kind of justification or meaning or something else. And we have, I don't know, millennia of philosophical investigations where, oh, this is the meaning of suffering. I don't know. we all want to believe. Our brain is wired to believe in the just world. We have just world hypothesis. This is the common form of bias in the world, where we think that people who are suffering for a reason. We want to find a reason for it, even if there is none, even if when it's random. And Nabokov, I think, is engaging with a little bit of that in the story when he narrates one misfortune after another, but in between, he will engage in that sort of profound metaphorical language where things are connected that are not supposed to be connected. That kind of referential mania, which gives joy, which connects words and ideas and events and phenomena in ways that are that lead to little explosions of joy in the reader's mind. And the Simeon stoop, it's haunting. It's so unbelievably memorable. Once you read it, you will never forget that. And as the monstrous darkness approaches. By the way, the Simeon stoop was added in the second version. This is why I'm saying that I think Nabokov was improving his text, amplifying this step by step. So this is bad happening, and this, look what the human mind can do, even in this horrible situation. And then another statement or instance of misfortune, loss, tragedy, disruption, violence, erasure. And then the next paragraph or section of the story will be about, look what the human mind can do. It's like, it's a weird counterpoint, I guess, of those two very different, I don't want to say perspective, but whatever that may be. And then the story ends inconclusively. Nabokov doesn't allow either of those impulses to win in the end. Whatever wins happens or wins in the mind of the reader once the book is put down. And it can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. It could be another instance of misfortune, another item on the list. There are so many of them. We can expect it to grow. Or it could be another beautiful paragraph where, look what the human mind can do. I don't know. To me, this is the Nabokov is or can be pretty annoying and infuriating in so many ways. As the author of Lolita, he is that and nothing else in that book. But when it comes to him as a writer as a whole, on the whole, like the oeuvre, the story, the narratives that he created, I think this is one of those, along with Pnin, where he, I don't know, it's transcendental almost. It just gives you something that you don't expect from a white cis dude, from the mid 20th century.
I think it's curious what you're saying. Those two passages, those two particular transcendental passages, and I totally agree with what you said, come at the end of sections 1 and sections 2, which might mean that we should read the end of part 3. There are 3 parts in the story, numbered parts, which is the final paragraph, this listing of, at the end, the listing of the different jelly flavors, and Gennady Barbtarla, in the Nabokovian, and a mentor of mine, suggested that this sequence implies that things are going bad. It's getting more and more tart. I always get my flavors mixed up, but it's worse and worse. He had got to crab apple, sour, when the telephone rang again. So maybe the implication is something bad is coming. But anyway,
as we're going, I mean, this is, I guess, part of the upside of this kind of communal experience is you get to put more and more thoughts together. So as we're talking about this, makes me even just talking about, I think about other recent podcasts. Not too long ago, we were talking to Dr. Tatiana Grishkovich about the Kreutzer Sonata, and a little bit about, was it Nabokov's Poznichin address? I forget exactly what it's called, and connecting all things we were talking about there, bringing here. So no, this has been fantastic.
Yeah, we were like, what are the odds we get hermeneutics of suspicion like twice, like back to back, just like on scheduling, like peculiarities. Yeah.
We also just did Leviathan, as you started talking about kind of suffering. Sarah, we had this long discussion about the Book of Job as we were talking about the movie Leviathan. So I was like, this has been great. This has been truly fantastic as neurons are firing on at least some of the cylinders I got.
What's left
at this point? Yeah. But Matt, I'll give it to you to kind of take us over to some community questions that people had.
Yeah, we have this garnered quite a lot of interest on our Discord server. But the very first softball question that I have is, what book do you recommend for somebody who's just starting with Nabokov? Somebody that asked this question said that they had read Lolita, but it wasn't easy and it contained topics that they didn't really want to read about, and presumably not everybody wants to read about.
Sorry, do you mind if I break in here? Also, we categorically cannot recommend Lolita on this podcast because in college, one of my housemates played a prank on me where I've never bought a copy of Lolita, but I had my high school girlfriend gave me a copy and I kept it to college. Then another roommate left me her books. Among them was Lolita, and then my roommates thought that was really funny, so they started giving me more and more copies of Lolita until I had a big collection. And when we had a party, people came over, they'd say, "Oh, this is Cameron's collection of Lolita," and there'd be like 6, which is obviously not what you want. So we can't recommend that one.
Big fan. Okay, yeah. Well, that's not the one, or any of the one that Sara and I decided to suggest, despite what this community member suggested. I'll just be brief. The ones that came to mind for me were the Delusion Defense, Nabokov's third novel, originally in Russian, about chess. If you've watched the Queen's Gambit, it might be of interest as well. And if you want to get into the more experimental and wacky in some way, Pale Fire. I think Pale Fire is its humor is underrated. I think it has great standing and is a classic. But I think it's such a funny book and incredible in what it pulls off.
What's the most pretentious book I could read? If I had like one where people are like, "Wow, this guy's really smart. He read this by Nabokov." What book is that?
I would say Ada or Ardor.
Okay.
It's his longest. It's a big one. So if you want to put that on your bookshelf, on your bedside table, or on the subway or something, that's.
Oh yeah. No, I'm not going to read it. It's for display, only for other people to see. Right.
Yeah. Sarah, what do you think?
Pale Fire, probably in the more experimental category, or ambitious, or pretentious, if you will. But my personal favorite, and the book that I think was what's the word? Again, it's not a successful book. It was successful when it was published. It put Nabokov on the map. Before Lolita, there was Pnin, and it served that purpose for him. But I also think it's success in purely literary terms. I think it achieves more than the ostensible ambition may be, or the motivation of the author may have been, the authorial intention behind the book. I think it's the most humane and the kindest book he wrote. It's about a Russian professor in America undergoing again a series of misfortunes and somehow managing to preserve his kindness despite it all. And I am convinced at this point that Pnin, P-N-I-N, is actually meant to evoke the word in English, which word processors very often correct this title to, which is pain. And it's also the book where nobody dies on stage. So the only novel Nabokov wrote where nobody dies on stage. So another reason to like it.
So Nabokov did not like Dostoevsky, which is a terrible blow to some people listening to this who may not know too much about Nabokov, but do love Dostoevsky. Why did Nabokov dislike Dostoevsky? Is there a convincing reason or no? Ever since I learned that he, and then parentheses or brackets here, Nabokov lost esteem in my eyes, and I haven't read any of his work. Sorry, I did a mixture of paraphrasing and reading exactly that question, so apologies to that community member.
Cameron stopped reading forever after he learned that.
I'm trying to summarize the readings I did in grad school on this very topic, and it just so happens that the articles on this topic were published by the two mentors of mine, Julian Connolly and Alexander Dalinin, and the most concise version of the answer would be that Dostoevsky engaged in a kind of psychological, emotionally charged writing that Nabokov wanted to do as well, but under strict control of the author. He wanted to achieve the same literary effects that Dostoevsky did, but without ever losing control as the author, never ever allowing his characters to dominate the plot. For Nabokov, it was always about the tricks that the author can engage in, can show off in achieving a certain outcome in the plot, as opposed to creating a personality or a persona and then letting the personality grow, become, do things, relate to others, etc. I think that would be the answer. And plus, Dostoevsky was becoming famous as the father of existentialism in the 40s. His reputation skyrocketed after the war, especially in American academia, and I think he was annoyed by how quickly it happened and kind of like, oh, Dostoevsky's not a good writer. Why paying so much attention? It was a way to kind of assert his own growing fame in America, especially as an instructor. I think it was more complicated behind the scenes than on the surface of things.
Okay, rapid fire. Did Nabokov interact with any expats in France, specifically Joyce, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, or did he have any opinions on their writing that might be interesting? I feel like Joyce might be an interesting one from José's perspective.
Yeah.
As someone who knows a thing or two about Joyce as well.
Yeah, they met a few times in France, and the first meeting is this fantastic story. There's an article about this, which I'm sure will be in the show notes. I can send a PDF. Cough. If anyone needs it. It's great. It lays out what happened. So Nabokov at the last minute was asked to give a lecture because someone else had to cancel. So he was giving a lecture on Pushkin, I believe. And he looks up from the podium and he sees not only the Hungarian soccer team, but James Joyce sitting in the audience, who just by chance was there that evening as well. They had some mutual acquaintances, friends, but he's there. And in his recollection of this moment, Nabokov mentions Joyce's glasses gleaming, I believe, as he sits there kind of listening to Nabokov lecture. And in fact, Nabokov wrote to Joyce with an offer to translate Ulysses, which, unfortunately, it didn't come to be translated into Russian. It's this amazing what if in world literature. And they interacted a few more times through these mutual acquaintances. And what did he think about his writing? Loved Ulysses, had some complaints about it, certainly apparently despised Finnegan's Wake, called it, I don't know, something like hokey pokey or sludge, some strong kind of folkloric nonsense, something along those lines.
Good. And presumably Joyce's glasses were gleaming because of the brilliance of Nabokov's words as he was delivering these.
Yeah, these words were just bouncing off
Yeah.
Sparkling. Yeah.
Yeah. Radiating off, inspiring everyone in the room.
Let's talk about beef, and then we'll wrap up here. Which modern author would Nabokov love, and which would he absolutely have beef with?
So the one that came to mind, and maybe it's a recency bias, is Jenny Erpenbeck, the German writer. She wrote Go Went Gone about the migration crisis in Europe, and Visitation, which is a novel about a house and its many occupants over the years. Her most recent novel, Kairos, just came out in English translation. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's something about the kind of light touches of experimentation in the novel, her novels, as well as her prose, the style that reminds me of Nabokov, which isn't necessarily a sign or a symbol that he would love it, but there's something, I think, something there that I think he might appreciate. And this topic of migration and exile and refugee, I think, would certainly speak to him personally.
Thank you, Jose, for the name, because I never heard of her. I'm excited to dig deeper, I guess. It's interesting. I think my impression generally was that that curated persona that Nabokov created in his time as a college professor and then as a world famous public figure, public author, had a taste, and that taste was often exclusionary in a way that created this impression that, oh, he likes certain authors and he hates others. And I think this is where the question is coming from a little bit. Like, he must really like somebody and he must really hate people, authors that do not conform to his expectations. And I think Nabokov, the person, had a taste that was broader than that. At least that's my impression. When reading his letters, for instance, you come across him passages where he is raving about an author that you never expect him to be enthusiastic about, and for reasons, explicitly stated reasons that, again, clash with the reasons usually given by that public persona. Like Céline, the French homosexual, low-class author who writes about criminal life in France. Nabokov was ecstatic when he discovered the author, and he was like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And he only admitted that in private, though. This is the thing. In private, his taste could be surprising and interesting. And I think this is where I'm at. This is where my mind goes when I'm trying to think of an answer to this question. Like, anyone really who is good at writing, at just going with the flow of creation, creativity, experimentation, play with language and cognition, and ways to tell a story. Anybody who engages in it with earnestness and abandon can probably win points from Nabokov. And yeah, I really hope that that's the case. Maybe projecting.
Finnegan's Wake, he hated it.
Finnegan's Wake, he hated?
Mm-hmm. That's what he said.
Again, in public. In private,
Public, yeah.
he wrote Ada, which is, for one thing. For another, there's a passage in Lolita where it's a mixture of languages that Nabokov himself admitted. In that passage, there's a quote that, oh, I'm actually, ventriloquizing James Joyce, the sublime Dubliner, the Dublinois sublime, or whatever the French is. I don't know. I'm being contrarian, perhaps, and I'm sorry if that comes across as that.
Well, the difference is he did it better, so then it's okay. Right? That's what he would say.
Maybe much like Cameron's friends leaving him copies of Lolita, and Nabokov's friends would leave him copies of Finnegan's Wake, and he was just really riled up that one time.
I think for now that's a good place to leave it. I think that's a good answer to leave it on. Sara, Jose, thank you both so much for being here and sharing so much knowledge. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and has tied up a lot of other questions that we've had on our minds recently, or at least given us a way forward. So that's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
I would say buy their book, but it's free. So now you have to read it.
But I believe you can if you want to, if you happen to have either an institutional library or that kind of money. Yes.
Oh yeah, you can also buy it.
Yeah. And it's just $20 if birthday money, whatever.
There you go.
Tooth Fairy.
You can find a link in the show notes.
Prefer the hard copy, yeah.
Right. And the hard copy is nice to read from. It's been sitting in my bag for like the last month, I think now. So when picking it out, very easy to read. So it's a great satchel reader. I don't know if that's a term, an equivalent to your coffee table reader.
I would also recommend that you pick up 2 copies because the cover, the front and the back cover is a big picture of Nabokov. So if you put 2 copies together, it'll form Nabokov, his whole face. It's yeah.
So if you want to display it to everyone, you can go ahead and do that. And you should.
Right.
You should display. You should let everyone know. Both about Nabokov and about the book. But thank you both for joining us so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks, guys.
And in addition to thanking Sara and Jose for joining us today and sharing their knowledge, we wanted to thank all of you for listening this far. And you may be wondering at this point, what are we tackling next week? Well, we're heading back to Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and we're going to be covering chapters 10 through 18. So if you read along with us, that's your goal. All right. Well, to help keep our show independent and for exclusive access to show notes containing all the research that went into the episode, head on over to our website, slaviclitpod.com. Before we let you go, we wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current supporters: Ben, Jeff, Mai, Daniel, Lou, Gary, Janice, Anne, Isaac, Emily, Caitlin, Yitza, Irene, and Pack Rob. We wouldn't be able to make this podcast without your support, covering our many expenses from music to website to all the other things that just rack up as you're doing this sort of thing. So seriously, thank you for all your help. The music used in this episode was Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify, and the links, as well as the spelling, are in the show notes. You'll hear from us again soon.